February 1945. The Reichsstrasse 6 near Kappisbus, Germany. The road is a gray, frozen ribbon cutting through the snow-dusted Brandenburg fields. The air is so cold it burns the lungs. Obergruppenführer Klaus Richter, a young tank gunner pressed into the infantry, hunches low behind the wheel of a massive stalled STDKFZ-7 half-track. He doesn't need to look at the gauge. The silence is the answer. The rhythmic tick of cooling metal is the only sound where the deep, comforting growl of a diesel engine should be. "Still nothing, Klaus?" asks Feldwebel Hans Moeller, dropping into the seat beside him. His breath clouds the air, his face pale with fatigue and worry. Klaus shakes his head, his helmet scraping the canvas roof. "Empty, drier than the road to Minsk, and we burned the last reserve moving the Panther yesterday." Mullen looks out at the scene. A column of elite German armor, Panthers and Tigers, stretched for a kilometer, not knocked out by anti-tank guns, but simply abandoned. Soldiers are huddled in the snow, trying to warm their hands over sputtering fires fueled by split crates. The most potent army in Europe, reduced to a line of magnificent, immobile monuments to failure. This was the new reality on the crumbling Eastern Front. The Soviet steamroller was advancing rapidly, but the German military, the Wehrmacht, was finding itself paralyzed, not by direct confrontation, but by parched fuel tanks. From the early days of the war, German military might had depended on blitzkrieg, lightning war, a doctrine of speed, mobility, and deep armored thrusts that required limitless access to fuel. But Germany, unlike the Allies, had no natural oil reserves. It relied almost entirely on synthetic fuel, produced through the complex and costly process of coal liquefaction. For years, the vast subterranean complexes of Luna and Politz had churned out the fuel that drove the Panzer divisions and fed the Luftwaffe. The Allies knew this, and in a masterstroke of strategic warfare, the 8th and 15th U.S. Army Air Forces had unleashed the Oil Campaign, a systematic, relentless, and often unbelievably accurate bombing effort targeting every major synthetic fuel plant in the Reich. Now that strategy was bearing a bitter, frozen harvest on the ground. "We can't even pull the Tiger," Moeller mutters, gesturing to the heavy tank 50 meters ahead, its gun barrel lowered in submission. "We need 3 of these half-tracks, and we can't even fuel one." Klaus looks up, not at the eastern horizon where the Soviets lie, but at the empty gray sky. That sky, once the domain of the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wuls, was now a silent, deadly threat. Because every minute the sky remained clear of the Luftwaffe, it meant that the bombers were flying and the fuel plants were burning. The Americans weren't fighting them on the ground. They were killing them through the industrial air war. They were choked, strangled, unable to even retreat from the inevitable. Mid-1944. Luna, synthetic fuel plant, central Germany. The German war machine was powered by a secret, synthetic fuel. The major production facilities at Perlitz, Luna, and Blackhammer were technological marvels, converting coal into high-octane gasoline and diesel, a necessity born of strategic geography. Hitler's early blitzkrieg successes in 1940 and 1941 were fueled by seizing Romanian oil, but that supply was finite and vulnerable. By 1944, the fate of the Wehrmacht rested on the fragile piping, cooling towers, and liquefaction chambers of these few key sites. The Allies, specifically the U.S. Army Air Forces Command, understood this better than Hitler's own economic planners. They saw the German economy not as a collection of factories, but as a body with a single massive artery: oil. In May 1944, just before the D-Day landings, the Allies formally launched the oil campaign. The strategic goal was brutally simple: deprive the German military of the fuel necessary for mechanized war. The execution of the campaign was a grinding, methodical terror. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, escorted by the deadly P-51 Mustangs, which had stripped the Luftwaffe from the skies, arrived day after day, week after week. They didn't hit cities, they hit specific industrial targets. Major Otto Schulze, a factory chief engineer at the massive Luna complex, watched the devastation with a sickening clarity that was often missing in the Nazi high command. From his reinforced bunker, he could feel the earth tremble under the carpet bombing. The Americans, they do not simply bomb, they study. They hit the critical junction point of the hydrogenation towers. They sever the primary water lines. They know precisely where the destruction causes the maximum possible loss of output. The output drops were catastrophic. By the summer of 1944, German fuel production was halved. By the end of the year, it was reduced to a mere trickle, less than 10% of what was required to fight on two fronts. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had excellent jets like the Me-262, but they sat uselessly on airfields, grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Tanks, like those abandoned by Klaus Richter, were delivered to the front only to become expensive, immobile bunkers. The strategic denial of fuel cascaded through every aspect of the German military. Training programs for new pilots were curtailed. Troop transfers by train were slowed or stopped. Even the Wehrmacht's ability to bring up food and ammunition was compromised. The German soldiers on the front were not just fighting Allied troops. They were fighting the empty space in their fuel tanks, a constant psychological drain that stripped the German war machine of its last essential quality: mobility. The shock felt by soldiers like Klaus was not just a shortage, it was the realization that their commanders had lost the entire logistical war. December 1944, Boston, Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Offensive, was Hitler's last desperate gamble. It was an attack designed to split the Western Allies, and it required a massive coordinated movement of the last armored reserves, the Panzer divisions. The success of the initial thrust surprised the Americans, but the fuel crisis was a ghost that haunted every kilometer of the advance. Hauptmann Dieter Voss, a veteran tank commander leading a Tiger II company in the 6th Panzer Army, felt the chilling reality of the fuel shortage, not as an abstract problem, but as a ticking clock. Voss's orders were impossible. Drive through the Allied lines, seize the fuel depots at Stavelot, and then push on to the Meuse River. The irony was bitter. The only way to get fuel was to capture Allied fuel. They carried only enough in their tanks to reach the American supply lines. The initial shock of the German breakthrough was quickly absorbed by the stubborn defense of places like Bastogne. But even as Voice's Tiger IIs, the heaviest and most powerful tanks in the world, shattered American defenses, their speed was agonizingly slow. Every road intersection was choked with traffic jams of wear-marked vehicles, tanks, trucks, and artillery, all forced to share the same few precious liters of gasoline. "We are stalled again," Voice shouts to his radio man, peering out of his turret at the immobile mass of steel ahead. "We have the might, but no movement. A tank that doesn't move is just a target." The situation was absurd. The most technologically advanced military in Europe was being stopped by traffic control and thermodynamics. Fuel-starved panzer columns were forced to bypass easy targets and take circuitous routes, not to avoid enemy fire, but to conserve every drop of diesel. Many German vehicles, particularly those of Kampfgruppe Piper, ran dry and were simply abandoned on the roadsides, their crews forced to retreat on foot, leaving behind millions of Reichsmarks worth of irreplaceable equipment. The failure of the Ardennes offensive wasn't just a failure of battle planning, it was a devastating logistical indictment. The American and British armies, supplied by the relentless Red Ball Express and backed by an uninterrupted flow of oil from the States, could maneuver, reinforce, and counterattack with speed. The Germans, however, were fundamentally immobile. The Luftwaffe was a ghost, unable to provide air cover or reconnaissance. The panzers were statues. The GIs who recovered the abandoned German equipment, seeing massive King Tigers parked nightly on the side of the road with empty fuel tanks and intact engines, were stunned. It was a realization that went beyond tactical victory. It showed them the utter industrial dominance their nation held over the collapsing Reich. The battle was being won not just by rifle and shell, but by petroleum and air superiority. Spring 1945, the Rhine River Valley, Western Germany. The war had become a slow, painful execution. By the time the Allied armies, now fully reconstituted after the Ardennes, reached the Rhine River and crossed it at places like Remagen, the German military machine was in complete paralysis. The sky was permanently owned by the Allies. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, now retreating across his homeland, no longer saw the occasional stalled vehicle. He saw entire logistical movements halt. Rail lines hammered beyond repair by Allied bombers like the B-26 Marauder, targeting bridges and marshalling yards, were useless. Every journey was on foot. The strategic denial of fuel, once a mere annoyance, had become absolute zero. The remaining panzer divisions could only move when absolutely necessary, often relying on captured Allied fuel, or simply being told to drive until their tanks ran dry, then serve as static artillery until overrun. Klaus witnesses a desperate scene. A small column of German trucks being methodically strafed by a pair of passing P-47 Thunderbolts. The trucks are destroyed, not for the men they carried, but for the barrels of synthetic fuel they held, the last liquid lifeline of the Reich. Klaus and his comrades scatter into the woods, knowing that the real danger is not the enemy infantry ahead, but the invisible, relentless presence of the American Air Force above. The final irony was that the German soldier was technically better equipped on the ground than he had ever been, with new weapons like the STG-44 assault rifle reaching the front line. But a superior rifle meant nothing when the food, ammunition, and reinforcements could not reach the fighting. The vast self-sustaining logistical superiority of the Allies, the ships from America, the trains across France, the pipelines and the fuel that flowed endlessly, had triumphed over German battlefield innovation. When the final orders came to surrender in May 1945, the vast majority of German motorized units in the West were not captured in battle. They were found, often fully armed, parked and abandoned on the side of the road, choked by the strategic air war that had destroyed the oil campaign targets months before. For soldiers like Klaus, the disbelief was complete. They were defeated not by a single man or a single battle, but by the overwhelming industrial might of an enemy they had been taught to despise as soft and ill-prepared. The ghost of the empty fuel tank was the true harbinger of the Third Reich's ruin.